The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold! Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and 2 races into the 2024 F1 season, plenty of questions have been answered, but things aren't yet so predictable that we know everything. So what are the key things that we still need to learn, and what do they mean for the upcoming races? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us to sort the known from the known unknowns are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Diego Mejia. Well, Diego, welcome back. Great to have you here. Obviously, it's been a busy start to the season, so how have you been enjoying it?
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Scott. Well, I've enjoyed these first 2 races. It's been, a bit like at the end of last year. I guess the pecking order hasn't changed dramatically. The cars, some of them have visually. But yeah, I guess we still have to see a lot of things unfold, not only in this first part of the year, but especially when we get to race 6, 7, when we start the European Tour and cars start changing, and maybe performance start changing also, because after 2 races there hasn't been like an earthquake in terms of the order as yet.
Yeah, but fortunately still some questions to be answered, and we should say, for those who don't know, Diego is the voice of the race in Spanish on YouTube, which is great. If you're a Spanish speaker, you can avoid having to listen to the likes of me and Scott so often. So how's that been going? That's been going great.
Yeah. We've had our best month. Obviously, all the launches and preseason testing was massive, and we had like 4 million views, which was way above what we had before. So yeah, it's been going really well. You guys do a great job in putting everything together, and the whole team behind the cameras and the videos are doing also a great job to deliver videos very quickly of very high quality. And I just do my bit of putting my voice in, which is not as good as yours. I try my best, but I think people like the content, how technical it is, and how much it goes down to the detail and the analysis. Also about the other things like the Red Bull saga and all that. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in Mexico about what goes on with Checo and what goes on with the team. So that's been a hot topic over there.
Yeah, plenty of talking points on and off track, despite the fact that the overall competitive shape hasn't changed too much. And Scott, how's life? Obviously, busy start for you as well. You've been recording lots of videos also.
Yep, it's been hectic considering the lack of dramatic on-track action we've had for the first couple of races. I think the saving grace of the opening 2 weekends was that each had its own kind of interesting narrative within. The first race is always interesting regardless of whether or not the Grand Prix itself is particularly fun, because you're seeing how everything shakes out and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns are sort of becoming a little bit clearer. And then in Jeddah, there was still a bit of intrigue about how that battle at the front would go, probably the teams behind Red Bull really. But obviously there specifically we had the Ollie Behrman story, and following him was interesting, especially as he was actually involved in a relatively interesting race story itself as well through the Grand Prix with Lando Norris and Lewis Hamilton behind him. So yeah, over the course of the season, we can't be relying on people doing an interesting job in 7th place. If we're still depending on that through much of the year, then I think F1's in a particularly concerning position. But I think actually, I think it was okay. The first couple of races, there is a sort of bigger concern hanging over this season and the level of interest in F1, but I found the first couple of events interesting enough.
I think it's one of the things about F1, isn't it? I'm not going to sit here and say it's been a classic start to the season or anything and just be accused of talking it up. But there's always stuff going on. There's always technical intrigue or the off-track, as Diego alluded to. There's always things going on. And even though you look at it and think, oh, what are the storylines going to be? We just know that we'll go to Australia and then it'll throw up a load more storylines and probably the Red Bull saga will keep going in one way, shape or form.
Well, yeah, we've got to find out the next way that Red Bull's going to implode. Like, what are they going to do next to completely undermine the fact that they've built yet again an incredibly dominant car? They've followed up the most dominant car in F1 history with what looks like might be the most dominant car in F1 history, and yet they're their own worst enemy. I
think you'll find they're all united. The whole Red Bull organisation, F1, is utterly united, and any suggestion otherwise, naive. That seems to be the feeling. But let's talk a bit about Red Bull on track, because in this podcast we're going to pick through 6 topics that we don't really know, things we don't 100% know about the coming season. There's still some big questions to be answered. And the first thing, Scott, is we don't really know how big Red Bull's advantage is. We know it exists and it's a decisive advantage, but how much have we actually seen so far and what's yet to be seen?
I think we saw the upper end of it across the 2 race weekends so far. Not necessarily the absolute maximum, but I think we got close to the upper end in qualifying in Jeddah. I think Verstappen was pretty comfortable over 1 lap in Jeddah, where I feel like the track is very grippy. And I feel like that really helps the Red Bull, which is very good on its tyres and probably mitigates a bit the weakness that it has in qualifying. So you saw that when car and driver are at one, like Verstappen seems to be in this car, he's a lot happier in this car just from a base position than I think he was the 2023 Red Bull. And how ominous is that, considering he won so many races last year? So I feel like in Jeddah, you saw what they're capable of in qualifying, which is actually if Max hooks it up and is happy, he's probably 2 or 3 tenths clear and should be or could be on pole more often than he isn't. And I think in Bahrain, you saw a glimpse of what it was capable of in the Grand Prix, because I just feel like in Jeddah, in the Grand Prix, never really got beyond 2nd or 3rd gear. Not literally, obviously. The car's not that good. But in Bahrain, it just felt like he won. What was the gap in Bahrain? Was it 20 seconds or so?
Yeah, around that.
And I think that gap could have been 1.5, 2 times as big if Max was ragging it from start to finish. Because I feel like Bahrain, in much the way that Jeddah, the track is quite useful for the Red Bull, perhaps in qualifying, in Bahrain, you have a circuit that brings the most out of the Red Bull in terms of its advantage in the race with how it looks after the tyres, because it is a unique circuit and the traction sensitivities are so great there. It's very rear limited. The Jeddah track's very different. So I feel like we've got a good idea of where that car is performance-wise over the 2 weekends. And it's very bad news for the people that are chasing them.
I don't know about you, Diego, but I often think that if you've got a 20-odd second lead, basically a pit stop's worth of lead, that tends to be a signal of utter dominance, doesn't it, in a race? Because there's no incentive to go and win by 30, 40 seconds, a minute, lap everyone. I'm not going to say Red Bull could lap everyone, but we don't really...
You've said it now.
Well, exactly. But we don't really know, because people don't extend themselves in the same way, because you've got to preserve much more in terms of the car, etc., than maybe you did when you could throw the engine away after the race. So that's just as good as utter dominance, isn't it? A pit stop in a race in terms of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess as Scott alludes, qualifying seems to be going a little better than last year. We still have to take in how much Ferrari probably have improved, and they had a really good car in qualifying at the end of last year with all those poles that Leclerc was able to get away from Max. But it seems really like the baseline for Red Bull this year is a little higher probably than what it was at the beginning of last year. I was very surprised when I listened to this was in Bahrain to Paul Monaghan speak about the car and say that it's not really a change of concept, that the visual change is more than how different the actual car is relative to RB19. So it doesn't seem like it's like a big departure in some departments as it might look. So that makes you think that they have everything very well aligned to bring more performance to the car anytime and deliver. Because one thing that Red Bull seems to really have over the rest is correlation. Whenever they bring, if they need to, because they didn't need much last year and they didn't bring a lot of things, but the fact that they're able to hit the ground running in the way they did in testing this year, for example, with Max so early into the test, it was so clear that car was born well, much better in his case than RB19. Last year, after these first two races, Checo had been, on pole. Oh no, he had won a race, but to some extent that was a bit circumstantial because of the issues that Max had in qualifying and how he had to come through the field in the race in Jeddah. Let's say the easiness with which Checo has been able to overcome his not ideal qualifyings, not bad, but not, let's say, ideal. He still has had to overtake some people. Also shows that, this car gives him confidence to do that. And if he has to wait one more lap and not get into a difficult position or a risky position, he doesn't have a problem in doing so, because I think he believes he has the car underneath him to get things done and deliver that 1-2 at the end of the race. So yeah, I guess we haven't seen really Red Bull under any sort of pressure. Maybe in qualifying a little bit, we could have seen a Ferrari pole in Bahrain had Leclerc put everything together like he did in Q2. But besides that, they're one step ahead.
Yeah, it's funny. The one thing we haven't seen from Verstappen is him starting down the grid and breezing through to win. But yeah, what Checo's done suggests that could be eminently doable for him. You mentioned the good correlation that Red Bull clearly have. It's worth having a listen to the episode of the Race F1 Tech Show with Gary Anderson that we released around the first race, called The Amazing Tech That Allowed Red Bull to Go Aggressive in 2024, which gets into the work they do with a company called ANSYS and the CFD work and that kind of thing. Although, funnily enough, you talking about Paul Monaghan railing against the word concept. This word concept, Scott, is always difficult, isn't it? Because basically everyone complains about it because it means everything and nothing, doesn't it? And you get different definitions from technical people depending on the day of the week and what they don't want to answer questions on.
Yeah, it's quite nebulous, and it's kind of, I feel like as a word, it's kind of all things to all people. You kind of throw it around and it just fits quite nicely into any kind of sentence, whether you're asking a question or answering one. Because you're right, it can basically mean as much or as little as the person who is using the word decides. So we saw, I think the most prominent example through this era so far has been the Mercedes. And the word concept is almost always related to, in terms of the people who are asking about it or commenting on it, has tended to relate to how the side pods looked and whether they had or had no side pods or whatever. And Mercedes was always very much against this because the concept is much more fundamental than that. It can be the underlying architecture of the car. It can be the way that the underfloor is working, all the stuff that you don't see, basically. And I have always considered concept to mean where the car is basically born in the first instance of pinning together how you want it to work and be built architecturally, and then how you want to utilize aerodynamic functions around that. So it's because it's conceptual. It isn't about the very last bit of aesthetics to the car. So with the Red Bull, quite a big change in visual elements. So I think there are elements to the RB20 that are revolutionary, but in conceptual terms, I suspect it's only evolutionary. It just builds on what they've been trying to achieve from the very start of this set of regulations, whether it is how responsive the front is without the rear being unstable, whether it's about not upsetting the center of gravity too much, whether it's about trying to master how tricky the naturally more rearwards aerodynamic center of pressure is with these cars. That comprehension, I think, dwarfs anybody else on the grid. And that's why I feel like the RB20 is just basically slightly better at everything than the RB19 was, because this is the team that has the best base concept. I think it has the best simulation tools, as Diego mentioned, so it has the best understanding of, therefore, how to improve things, because it can perform better tests and experiments behind the scenes, and then it can have more confidence that when it brings something to the track, that will actually work. And then the result is what you're seeing now, where a car that seems to pretty much work for both drivers in qualifying at the first two races, and is very much working for both of them in the race, in the first two races. The one asterisk I would put against it, and this is maybe something that rivals will cling to, is that this is how Red Bull started last season. And then Checo became gradually more vulnerable, but also they didn't develop the car through the year and others were able to catch up. So are all these advantages that Red Bull have more conducive to a strong start, and then therefore rivals can have a bit of confidence as the season progresses? Or are they just in such a good place that even if rivals do push back a little bit, then Red Bull can just respond?
But ultimately, a strong start buys you the chance to be more strategic with how you develop. You think, actually, it doesn't matter if people catch up a few tenths because we've got it in hand. We can invest that developmental resource in, say, next year's car, because obviously the more they can get done on the 25 car early, the more resources they've got to switch to 26 on the aero testing side once the aero testing ban's lifted at the start of next year. So I think any way you slice and dice it, Red Bull are in a great position and have done an absolutely fantastic job. The fault is not theirs in terms of F1 being a bit predictable. The fault is other teams not delivering. Diego, let's talk about Ferrari now, because the second thing we don't know is whether Ferrari can be best of the rest on all circuits. So what does the evidence so far tell you?
I'm going to bring an Alonso quote here, because while asking him about Berman's debut right after the race on Saturday in Jeddah, he was obviously full of praise for him, but he also mentioned that it's not the same making your debut in a midfield car than having the second best car or the best car, he said, like alluding to that Bahrain qualifying when they were actually the fastest, but didn't get pole because they didn't materialize the Q2 pace in Q3. He's sort of made this kind of mentions in the past. I guess last year he said that plenty of times, especially at the end of last year, like throwing stones a little bit at Ferrari, and maybe that they are not getting what they should from a car that is inherently much quicker than their results show. I guess last year, about this time, after the first couple of races, we had a picture that Ferrari was a quick car in qualifying. I guess in Saudi they were quicker to the pole than they were this year, but then they fell to pieces in the race, and they were not as quick as. It's evident that they've made a step forward with one of their weaknesses, which was their tire degradation and race pace relative to their qualifying pace. I haven't seen yet an Achilles heel for SF24, like it was so evident that last year, I guess. But it's only 2 tracks. I guess listening to Leclerc after the race, he right after it ended, he said that he struggled to be consistent throughout the race. He also mentioned that the car didn't turn the tires on as quick, probably as in the past. Is that a sign that it is really helping degradation in some way? Probably, but maybe Jet is not the best track to speak about that because of its characteristics. But they have definitely made steps in areas where they were not as good as last year. So the signs are there that they are literally the second best team as of now. But I guess maybe Japan will be more telling about that, because in Japan, I guess some of the teams that were strong at the end of last year, like McLaren, should show how much are they better now than they were at the end of last year, because we get to see Suzuka end of last year to Suzuka beginning of this year, and that's going to be quite interesting.
Yeah, Suzuka having an early slot in the season is quite interesting from that perspective. And, as you say, Jeddah's a weird circuit in terms of the tyres, because it's very high grip, so it stresses the construction of the tyre quite a lot, but it's very low abrasion, so it's fine for the surface, whereas Bahrain's almost the opposite, because it's a super abrasive surface, but doesn't sort of load the tyres as aggressively. So we've still got to learn a little bit more on that. But I do like the fact that the Ferrari is a more even proposition. And I guess, Scott, that just means that it's a question of, is that the firm foundation they wanted? What we've seen so far suggests yes. So could they be in that zone where just, if they can have a slightly quicker rate of development than Red Bull do, that could gradually bring them into the game as the next couple of years goes on?
Yeah, I apologise if you can hear some dogs barking at my end.
I always like a dog contributing to the podcast. Never apologise for that.
Exactly. Well, I say appropriately as we start talking about Ferrari. I think that was the second of my parents' dogs. I'm at my family's house in Kent at the moment. He's called Mansell. The other one is Senna. So appropriately named dogs to interfere with the F1 podcast. I think with Ferrari, I think I said this before, that I've got a little bit of a vibe of Verstappen's 2020 season in terms of, if Ferrari is as good through the year as the first couple of races has suggested, then it should be second best a lot more often than it isn't. And then I would expect Leclerc to be the person occupying that third step of the podium quite consistently through the year, or a Ferrari driver, certainly, because I hope that Carlos Sainz is back in Melbourne and fully fit and on top form. I think we made it very clear that we rated very highly the job that Behrman did in Jeddah, but you never want to see a driver get an opportunity because something's happened to another driver. So much like when Alex Albon was out after his appendectomy a couple of years ago, hopefully Sainz is back in after just a one race absence and gets the job done. I think both of them are fully capable of being on the podium, like I say, more weekends than not. For me, the big question mark is how much performance Ferrari can now layer onto this car. Do they just have something that is nice and compliant and workable now, but not quite quick enough? And that is a little bit of a hypercriticism, considering not quite quick enough is a car that could have had pole in one of the two races and has been better than Mercedes, McLaren, Aston Martin at both events so far this season. But they're judging themselves against Red Bull. They have to, because Ferrari's ambition isn't to be best of the rest. It is to win races and fight for the championship. Now, the second thing's not going to happen this year. It's pretty clear to me that this is a Red Bull Verstappen title in waiting already, unless something really dramatic changes through the season. But can Ferrari fight for wins? That depends on how well they develop this car and how much load they can add to it without disturbing anything, because I'm quite encouraged by the fact that they do seem to have addressed the biggest weaknesses of last year. But we've seen from different eras and different cars that you can make cars slightly better by just blunting that just that little tiny bit of sharpness that you need to be the outright fastest. And that's the question for me, is can Ferrari get that absolute peak back?
And just to put some numbers on it, even though we don't have many numbers, just looking at the what we like to call the super times, which is just the fastest lap of each car of the weekend as a percentage of the fastest. 2 data points is not a very good data set, but it's all we've got. And you've got Ferrari basically 0.183% off on average, whereas then you've got to go back to basically 0.4% off for Aston Martin and then 0.6 for McLaren and Mercedes. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we've seen so far in terms of that outright pace. That's qualifying pace, basically.
I might pressure you here, Ed, just to do a bit of live Google Sheet manipulation. How much did Jeddah change that? Not just necessarily the gap to Red Bull, but just with the gap that Ferrari had to the other teams, because obviously what we did have by having the Saudi weekend is we did get a second circuit data set when previously we were working purely off of Bahrain for testing and the opening round.
Well, if you look at it, Aston Martin were a lot closer because Ferrari obviously had the fastest time of all in Bahrain because of that Leclerc Q2 pace.
Lap, yeah.
Yeah, so basically you've got Aston Martin 0.423 off in Bahrain, Mercedes 0.359 off, McLaren 0.5 off. And then when you look at it for Saudi, obviously Ferrari were 0.365% off the fastest, and then you've got Aston Martin were 0.4 off the fastest. I'm being very careful with my percentages there because you can't sort of use percentage as a scale. So, it was a bit different in Saudi. So I think you could probably say that Bahrain suited the Ferrari a little bit more than Jeddah did, because it's always a difficult one because obviously Bahrain's such a tyre management track, even in qualifying. So it's a weird circuit where pace is a bit contained. So that's the question for me for Ferrari, which we'll see over the next few races. I think Albert Park and Suzuka and Shanghai that we've got coming up next are quite a nice set of tracks with different demands. So we'll get a reasonable picture. It's actually much better than what we had last year when we just seemed to have this just bludgeoning series of street-esque tracks largely at the start of the season. And you kind of get to Spain, you think this is about the first really conventional track we've been on, perhaps apart from Australia. So it's we're going to learn more about the performance profiles of the cars quicker than before. And as Diego said, Suzuka is a particularly good one just for pure aero demonstrations.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit-card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Right, item 3 on the agenda now. Scott, Aston Martin, specifically the question of whether it's getting anywhere. What progress have you seen so far and what do you need to see in the coming races?
I was encouraged by Jeddah in particular because Bahrain, I think, was slightly underwhelming. And Aston Martin often preaches, certainly Mike Crack does, that you can't read too much into individual races and you need to let a pattern build up and then judge that pattern. And I agree with that to a great extent. But what you can't hide from is when particular weaknesses get exposed. Regardless of whether it is in certain circumstances or certain tracks or track conditions or whatever, it does mean that your car has a weakness in that area. And what you learned from Bahrain was that there are clearly a set of circumstances in which the Aston's the fifth fastest car and kind of in no man's land in the race, which I thought was slightly disappointing and a little bit concerning, but not a write-off by any means. And then you go to Jeddah, and clearly, I think what Bahrain had seemed to confirm, I think Jeddah really delivered on, which is that car is clearly better in high speed than it was last year, when that was one of the weaknesses. And it does seem to be slightly better with its aerodynamic efficiency as well, in terms of it doesn't seem to be as draggy as it was before. But it's still lacking in some just performance. And whether that is low, medium, high speed, one lap pace, race pace, whatever. I think Alonso's getting a lot out of that car. Lance Stroll's still struggling with it, particularly in qualifying, but obviously shunted out of the race in Saudi. I'm not convinced that car's quicker than the McLaren. I still think it might be the fifth fastest car, but it is very much in the mix, which I think is encouraging. And so that means that the big question for them is the same question that we were asking over the winter, which is, will it develop well? Because last year, its development rate was poor. It kept bringing upgrades, which was good, but the impact of them was more miss than hit, and they kind of got lost a little bit along the way. What they've started the season with and what they talked about over the winter suggested that they have used the off-season very well to build on understanding where they went wrong last year. But I don't think we'll have a firm answer of that until we're halfway, two-thirds through the season, and we've seen one or two big upgrade packages make a difference or not.
And obviously there's an interesting subplot with Aston Martin in terms of Fernando Alonso's future, how happy he's been. He performed very well in the first two weekends, pretty much got the most out of that car. Diego, what's he been saying on the Spanish side? Obviously, with your Fox Sports work, you get to hear from him plenty. Obviously, we hear what he says in English, but sometimes people say things a little bit differently. What impression do you think he's got of Aston Martin in terms of its long-term prospects and what he's thinking about for next year? Do you think the way it started means he's looking at that Mercedes seat that's potentially, that is available, a little bit more eagerly? Or do you think he's becoming convinced Aston Martin could make the step?
I'm not really sure yet whether he's convinced that Aston is going to deliver and be a better option for him for next year and the next, I guess. I believe he said at some point that he'll wait out a few races to see. I guess he hasn't seen enough. I asked him about the Bob Bell incorporation, because he's a man from these good old days at Renault, winning the championship, and they shared the podium a few times. But he wasn't especially, he didn't say much about it really. I was expecting a little more, because it's something that has to do more with the future of Aston Martin than the present. And he didn't seem too, particularly happy about it. Just like another incorporation that hopefully brings something, but nothing special. I don't think he's yet made up his mind. Probably, it's so tight in that group that right now it's so difficult to tell. I mean, you looked at the fastest laps from many of those cars in Jeddah, and they were like a tenth from each other. I guess Alonso has done his bit just as last year in maybe putting that car a little bit further up than when it should be. Not only in qualifying, but in the race. I guess his race in Jeddah was really good. The team at least were quite impressed with what he was able to deliver. But yeah, he's like in a position where he's really key in terms of what happens with the driver market. And we're seeing good signs about improvements in some areas, but we still have to see whether they have the understanding that we thought they had a year ago, and they ultimately didn't. By Miami, we knew that they were playing so much with different things on the car and coming back and forth between rear wings that you didn't. I mean, you got a sense that they didn't have the direction clear of what they needed to do, and that then showed on their development rate. So that's one thing I wouldn't know if they have it. Hopefully they do, but yeah, I guess Aston Martin needs to do more to convince Alonso of staying further than this year.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the overall performance profile, I still sort of feel the Aston Martin's the fifth best of that lead group of 5 cars, because obviously had the ninth in Bahrain. Fifth in Saudi was good, but Russell should have outqualified him by his own admission and would have finished ahead of him then. If Russell could do that, Hamilton could have done. If Sainz had been there, he'd have probably been ahead. So it doesn't take long. Obviously, Norris dropped behind because of the strategy. So actually, you can end up adjusting that result to sort of shuffle him back down to basically ninth, which I think will concern him a little bit. So yeah, interesting to see how that evolves. But certainly there seems to be all sorts of time pressure on, because obviously Aston Martin will be pressuring him. They won't want him to be able to just to wait endlessly. But one thing we know with Fernando Alonso, you can't pressure him in the driver market or he'll do something unpredictable. So he'll be working very hard.
But also on that, what looks like his timeline, which seems to be making his mind up in the next few weeks, was what he kind of indicated in Jeddah, which went a little bit against what he was saying pre-season, where he said this would be something that he got asked about over the first few races. So I was kind of expecting it to run at least 2 or 3 months into the season, really. It definitely doesn't match with the other teams, the kind of places that Alonso will have his eye on. Mercedes and Red Bull, for example, they're the big ones for him in terms of, well, if he can get one of those seats, that's going to be massive. And I can't imagine someone like Alonso isn't holding out for a seat like that. But they're not making their minds up. I don't think Red Bull want to. I don't think Red Bull want to make a decision until the summer. They might go earlier if. I think we could do an entire podcast on this, but with where Daniel Ricciardo started the season and the fact that Red Bull just doesn't seem to have that faith in Yuki Tsunoda and doesn't view him in that way, the way that Checo started the season is a great place for him to secure that seat for 2025. So if that trend continues over the opening 6 or 7 races, Red Bull might think, actually, there's no decision to be made here. Like, it's Checo. And then they just do it nice and early. He can get his Monaco renewal in the bag again. But let's say that Red Bull hold out until the summer break just to see, get a really nice big set of data. We know that Mercedes has eyes on Kimi Antonelli, so then you've got probably the majority, if not all, of the F2 season really for that to be locked in. So what decision is Fernando alluding to? Is it just deciding whether to stay in F1? If it's that, then that's fine. That aligns, because then he can then take his time. Because I would imagine in the short term, is the number one choice of Aston Martin. Unless, obviously, they think that they can make some kind of dramatic play for Max Verstappen if he's unhappy at Red Bull Racing. Then Max is going to be your number one pick anywhere. But Fernando probably knows that with Aston, he can afford to wait. It's just whether or not another party makes a decision that closes the door sooner, whether Aston get impatient. So, yeah, the timelines aren't irreconcilable, but they don't line up. Not all of them, not Alonso's, Aston's, and where the other teams are at. They're all in slightly different places.
And it also depends what the contractual status is. It's not 100% clear whether Alonso's on a straight 2-year contract with Aston, this is the second year of, or whether there's a +1 in there. Because usually the convention is a 2+1 contract, and the way that deal happened, if there is a +1 in that, I would assume it's Alonso who's got control of that. So it could also depend on if Alonso does have a +1, which I assume he would do. I don't know for sure, though. Then it would be on his side, and there's always a cut-off for that, for taking up your option. So that could play into it as well. But this is going to be a regular talking point, I suspect, over the coming weeks and probably months. Let's now, Diego, talk about the next item on our list, which is that pack at the back. There's 5 teams in it, but we don't really know which of RB, Haas, Williams, Sauber and Alpine is the strongest in that group, except that it definitely isn't Alpine. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, we had the first couple of races with only maybe one of these teams being able to put one of their cars in in Q3 with the Haas in Bahrain and the RB in Jeddah. Yuki was already quick. In Bahrain, just I guess he was like 7,000 short of make it into Q3 in Bahrain. So that probably shows that amongst those cars, from my point of view, is the quicker of them right now. Maybe it suits more Yuki's style than Daniel's. I don't know if there's something with these ground effect cars that's not suiting Daniel at all, or what. But it's been strange to watch how Yuki has been able to make such a difference in these first two races, and especially in Jeddah in the race that Daniel was really nowhere. But last year by this time, I guess Jeddah was the first point for Haas too. So it's quite a similar situation, but they achieved that in quite different ways. This year, the work that they did with Kevin to allow this gap and assure that Hulk was able to get that point was very good teamwork. I don't know about Williams. I don't have a clear picture about Williams. I have my hopes on them really starting to deliver at some point.
They're going to finish 12th a lot, I think. They're very 12th this year.
Yeah, and the other thing is, you get from RB that it's a sort of carryover of what they did at the end of last year with AlphaTauri. So they're probably walking into this year with a bit more momentum that some of the teams around them that like Williams have made bigger changes to the car. So it's all very new at the back of the field. Only 2 races, and some of them probably haven't been able to optimize as much and really uncover the whole potential that the car has. It's changing quite a lot. I guess from race to race, we'll see different things. Alpine is really in a very difficult situation, both on the track and off the track, I guess. Bruno Faman is trying to stabilize the ship somehow, but it's not easy. I mean, this is going to probably take some time, and it makes you wonder what the future holds for the Renault team in Formula One.
It's a really interesting group because, with the exception of Alpine, for the reasons Diego mentions there, I don't really see any positives with where the car's at. The drivers will do what they can with it, and maybe there'll be some big upgrades in the first half of the season that do change things. But you look at the rest of it, the RB looks like it's a slightly better qualifying car than a race car. The Haas have the best qualifier in that group of drivers in Nico Hülkenberg, and looks like it might now have a car that can actually utilise that as a weapon. I asked Aya Komatsu this in Bahrain, actually. It's like, and he gave me a little bit of stick, because I said, oh, well, it's kind of pointless having someone as good as Nico qualifying the car, and he sort of laughed and said thanks. But he accepted that now it is a weapon that they might be able to use more. And I think they do have 2 drivers who have quite interesting skill sets in that group, as were shown in Jeddah, with Hulk actually executing a really strong race and Magnussen being as dark artsy as he needed to be in order to play his role in that. So Haas is quite interesting there, in that I think that is quite a potent contender over one lap and is actually now competitive enough over race distance. I have a sneaking suspicion that Williams might have the best race car of that group, but I don't. It's a bit more of a gut feeling than it is one that I can present like emphatic evidence to support my case for. And I also think it's got quite a good ceiling to develop into, because they're not where they wanted to be at the start of the year because of the horrific winter that they had, and with how massively behind the car build was, and how that impacted both time and money spent on developments. Instead of chasing performance, they were just chasing parts, basically, for the start of the season. So quite optimistic there. And then Sauber, it's a car that's clearly quite good in a race. So but it just qualifies really badly. So it is a really interesting pack, and I just feel quite sorry for them because I think what they'll be doing more than anything else is sniping for the odd 10th place finish at the moment, unless something dramatic happens. There's no reason, if everything goes according to plan, there is no reason for any of those 5 teams to finish in the top 10 in a Grand Prix at the moment. I think there's quite a clear split between the two groups of 5.
Yeah, it makes for quite a nice little pack at the back, actually, because of the varying characteristics, who's strong in qualifying, who's stronger in the race, who's got a decent all-round car, who might develop well, etc. None of it looks particularly good for Alpine, except for the fact there's not many points there. So actually, that could mean recovering to 6 for them is more plausible. If it takes them half a season to get that car into a better position, then nobody will have pulled away that much. But there could be some days where there's some big points on the table that will swing those battles championship-wise. I wanted to mention as well Saudi, because as you said, the race pace is pretty good, and people might think, hang on, Saudi didn't look very good, but there were reasons for that, with Joe having to do massive lifting and coasting because of his overheating problems, and Bottas just couldn't get the hard tyres to switch on. Took him like 15 laps to get temperature into them, and that's connected to why the Sauber is a poor qualifying car, but a much better race car in terms of the way it treats its tyres. So there's lots of intertwining performance profiles there in that group, which should make it quite fun. And so if that was the group at the front, we'd be saying this was a classic season, very likely. Well, let's move on to our 5th unknown, Scott, because it's McLaren. First couple of tracks weren't ideal for them, Bahrain in particular, Saudi Arabia a little better. Australia has been a happy hunting ground for McLaren in recent years, though. So as we move on to some more conventional tracks, do you expect McLaren to get stronger?
It will be interesting if Melbourne follows the recent trend, because if that is the case, then they should be on the podium in terms of the steps that they tended to make from Bahrain to Saudi to Australia in the past. So I'm quite curious to see how they get on. I feel like there were enough positives across the first couple of weekends. There is a bit of an inherent disappointment in that where they were at the end of last season in general, and the way that they were talking so optimistically about this season. I really did hope that would be a car that was fighting to be second or third best, and not necessarily challenging Red Bull, but just looking a little bit stronger than it is right now. That said, Oscar Piastri was 4th in Jeddah, and Lando Norris would have had a better result had he not had his issue with the way that the strategy played out, and the fact that he couldn't come back the way that he wanted to in that final stint. And as much as Bahrain showed that there are some weaknesses that still exist at slow speed in particular, Jeddah showed that it is a stronger car at high speed, and there are parts where, just like last year, it's actually, if anything, marginally more competitive than Red Bull is in specific places. So the knowns of McLaren are that the weaknesses are pretty much still what they used to be, and the strengths are pretty much what they used to be. It's just everything's got a little bit better because everything has been improved by what they've done over the winter. When they go to Melbourne, it'll be quite interesting because it's a higher speed track than we were used to it being, because of the changes that were made, a couple of years ago now? I can't remember. Time has moved way too quickly, which is quite scary. So I think this is a track where McLaren has to be eyeing a podium for. And then it's a case of they go after that into Japan, which is another track that should be really good for them. So I feel like we're going to go to some tracks that are going to make the McLaren look really good, but then we'll get to a couple of street tracks again where it might look a little bit weaker. And until they improve, we've banged this drum so many times, the sort of underlying weaknesses that car has in slow speed and that McLaren's have. I think it will just be a little bit more track dependent than it wants to be. It's not, that car's just not quite the all-rounder that it needs to be and that they hoped to have for the start of the year.
I guess the interesting thing for McLaren is we're asking if they can get a breakthrough and get a win or two. And I suppose, Diego, there's some key tracks for them. It's going to be very much, there'll be certain ones where there's an opportunity. And I guess Suzuka is the one that will loom large. They were really quick there last year. That track should suit their car. So I guess that's what their season hangs on, really, isn't it? Because if McLaren gets to the end of the season, they've got a couple of wins, you'd say, yeah, that's a good step. But they could also end up with this, if they had a season like last season with kind of a reasonable number of podiums, that might feel a little bit like stagnation, mightn't it?
Absolutely. I guess you were there, Ed, at Jeddah when Andrea Stella was doing his car presentation and speaking at length about the car and the wing levels, the drag levels, and all this that well, actually in the race, it was one of the issues for them, and made it much harder for Piastri in overtaking. But as you well said, and I guess Andrea Stella put this out very clearly, that he said Japan is a big test for us. So that's the race where we will know whether they can really mix it up and put Red Bull under pressure at some point. It's going to be obviously a good track for Red Bull. Last year, I guess Max's pole was sublime, and he was in a different league. Shouldn't expect much different this year, but if McLaren are able to really be ahead like of Ferrari there, like they were last year, then it should be a good omen for the rest of the year for them. Maybe not as we would like them to be, much like in Interlagos, where for the first time in a few races Verstappen had to make a defensive move when Lando was trying to overtake him. We'd like to see more of that, but we still have to see whether the MCL 38 is going to be capable of that. I guess something that Andrea Stella told us while you were there, and I guess he was responding to your question, Ed, that they are expecting new components. He said it in this area of the car, showing like the front of the car, basically. They expect some new parts there in the first third of the season, and that's going to be key for them to make that step on one of the areas where the car has somewhat inherited MCL 60 traces. As of now, Andrea Stella put it very, very well, and this doesn't only apply to them, but to all teams. It's an averaging exercise, these first few races, where they're not really bringing any components, big changes to the car, massive changes in what you see in the shapes and everything, but they're trying to make the best of what they have before they bring the best, the first big upgrades come the European season. But I guess we still have to see that step from McLaren in the same way that they did last year. Then that would be the best news for us, I guess.
Yeah, the interesting thing was I continued to bother Andrea Stella with questions about that later in the weekend as well. And he said that step over the first third of the season, while it would improve the weakness, he said that the point where it can realistically become a good, strong, all-round car, and that's no longer a weakness, and it's just kind of ideally equally good across the whole range of corners and that kind of thing. It's probably a one-year project. So I think that weakness will remain. It's just a question of reducing the weakness, make that weakness less of a weakness as the season goes on for them, and then hope that next year things are good. And he said that was critical to understand and troubleshoot and get on top of, so they're 100% there for 2026. And let's get on to our sixth item now, Diego, because it's been a quietly successful start to the season for Sergio Perez, as you alluded to earlier. Second twice. The qualifying deficit to Verstappen has been around the 3.5 tenths mark in both events. Our sixth unknown is whether he can sustain it, given the trend we've seen in the past for things to get worse for him as the season goes on.
Yeah, last year the first stumble for Checo was Melbourne, actually. We remember him having these issues with under braking for turn 3, and some of the hard braking, just not getting the car to stop and going straight, and like he did in qualifying too. So hopefully he's able to have a proper weekend in Australia. Right now he seems, from the mental side, he seems like having a different approach to this year. I guess after he won the Jeddah race last year, and we sort of got from Red Bull that it's Checo's in the title fight and all this, and he jumped on that train, and that, in my belief, led to some of the issues that he had later throughout the year. I guess he's taking it race by race. Obviously, if you ask him what's the goal, he cannot say anything different than being world champion when you're driving a Red Bull. But I guess he understands that last year there were things that he probably should have handled differently. his approach into all this year with those mistakes, probably on the learnings, the lessons from last year have helped him. He seems to be in a very happy place. He seems to understand the car well with his side of the garage. He has the same people as last year. At the end of last year, I guess he was Abu Dhabi when they switched a couple of people inside his garage, more of like an exercise than probably looking at really changing the way they work during weekends. But it all remained the same for this year, so that's good. I mean, Checo has confidence in the people he has on his side, and that can only make them stronger. What he got away from these first two races, from what he told me, is that he feels he understands this car very well. Probably he didn't get to such a start as last year in terms of having that last day of testing and being able to try more his weakness, which is qualifying, and work on that more than this year. He didn't have that luxury this year, but he still feels that he has, probably the best car that he has had so far was the one in the race in Jeddah. And it seems like every time he jumps in, it only keeps building up. And that's good, but it's going to be very different races now. The next two were probably two of his worst last year. As we mentioned, Australia, and Suzuka was his lowest, I guess, last year. He was way off Max in qualifying. He had this penalty in the race, the coming together with Magnussen. He retired. Yeah, I guess that's the point where I've seen him like more defeated. Let's say when I talked to him in the TV pen right after he retired, once serving his penalty. So it's going to be a challenge, especially because Max is quite good around Suzuka, and it's the same issues as the years before. And from the first time Checo jumped in a Red Bull in a race weekend, you go out, Max puts the car in a surreal time on the first lap in practice. He stole the time, and that's the first reference you have, and you're always trying to catch up. Sometimes he's found, starting the weekend in a better place, and he's able to be closer to Max. Sometimes be a little quicker, but right now is the same as the years before. I think he has only become stronger mentally with all that he's gone through last year, and hopefully that helps him, achieve what he still has to achieve, which is a more consistent season. Not only at Red Bull, even before that's been a weakness of him, and when he clearly targeted last year as being the main goal, to be more consistent along the year. If he's able to arrive in Europe with a consistent run of podiums, I guess that's going to be a very solid basis on which to build from for the rest of the year.
The interesting thing with Checo is he said he's a lot more happy with the car, the turn-in characteristics, and you can see that a bit trackside. You can see it from the onboards as well, because when he's struggled, as he often has with the car, you can see he's a tiny bit tentative on turn-in, and then that sort of turns into effectively just a bit of under-rotation, looks like a bit of understeer effectively because of that. So that's positive. So, and Scott, you'd have to say that if you look at the battle for that second Red Bull seat next year being between three drivers, him and the two RBs, Perez has been the best of those three across the first two race weekends, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has. As I said earlier, I think if it carries on in this direction, I don't see any reason why Red Bull wouldn't retain him. Because if it's a straight choice between those three, Checo is doing what he needs to do, and he's doing more than he was doing at the end of last year, which is the level that Red Bull suggested he needed to be at in order to retain his seat. This is more competitive. One of the questions is not just whether or not this can be sustained in this exact level of performance as the car develops, because we've seen the car develop away from him in the past and he's become more uncomfortable with it, but it's also whether or not that gap in qualifying becomes a bigger problem as the season progresses, because if Red Bull is caught up, then that 3 tenths to Verstappen for someone like Checo, I think is fine. I think that is broadly where he needs to be, but he also needs the competitive order to be supportive in that regard. What he can't afford is for him to be 3-4 tenths off Verstappen and then half a dozen cars be in that gap, because then he's qualifying a lot further back. He's not just on the second row or whatever. He's down in 7th, 8th, 9th, maybe even missing out Q3 sometimes because he's particularly uncomfortable. And then the recovery drive is only to 3rd, 4th or 5th, and everything just looks a bit worse. So it's not just his performance relative to Verstappen, it's the Red Bull performance relative to the field. But I'm impressed by the start of the season. I think he's clearly used the winter well. He's had a bit of a Valtteri Bottas reset over the winter. He's got himself into a good headspace. He hasn't let last season completely demoralise him. What he needs to do is just keep focused now, keep working on that kind of race-by-race mentality and not get drawn away, drawn into sort of delusions of grandeur about fighting for a title. The best version he can be of himself is himself, not someone trying to beat Verstappen. Be the best Checo you can be, and this is the level of performance you can get out of him.
Yeah, and one thing that he got away from last year, I asked him what was his biggest lesson out of last year, and he mentioned that while working on trying to improve the car to what he needed, he went in a direction that in the end they found out it made the car slower. So he was probably chasing a car that he'd feel more comfortable with, but not necessarily was going to be quicker. And that's what happened. So I guess he understood he needs to adapt, obviously. It's not easy, probably to adapt to a car that suits your teammate so well in some ways. But we get to Suzuka quite early in the season, so you would guess that the car hasn't changed dramatically. Whereas when we got to Suzuka last year, the car had already, let's say, drifted away from what Checo liked. So in many ways, you should expect him to be in a much better position this year once we get to that race 4. But hopefully that's the case for him.
Yeah, and I think, as has been referenced, the key is him just focusing completely on himself and not trying to be Verstappen. I always thought one of the most telling incidents last year was in Hungary, where on the first flying lap on Friday, he dropped a wheel, didn't he, and put it in the wall. And it could just have been one of those things, but it just felt a bit to me like he's right. Max always goes out and first laps are really quick, so I'm going to do it. And rather than kind of feeling his way into the weekend the way that really is good for him, he was trying to put himself sort of at a pace that he was not comfortable with immediately and just had a moment of imprecision. So ultimately, yeah, I think as you said, Scott, his best chance of staying on next year is just to be Checo Perez, and because he's a better driver than what he showed last year. He's not an incompetent Grand Prix driver by any stretch of the imagination. There are weekends where the pace deficit was too big, even someone like Verstappen. But I think he just feels calmed and settled. And I think that work at the back end of last year, kind of from Austin to the end of the year, really helped him, including that Abu Dhabi postseason test as well, where he just had a day which was basically a day to focus on himself, because Red Bull didn't really have to do any particular testing stuff. So he could just do a day of working on what works for him and some setup work. So yeah, hopefully he can sustain this from his perspective, because as Christian Horner said, that seat is his to lose. And right now he's on a trajectory to keep it. Just there's 22 races left, so needs to sustain it for a good time. So thanks very much to Scott and Diego for your insight. Like I've mentioned, go to the race in Spanish on YouTube if you understand Spanish and would rather not listen to me and Scott, because Diego does some great work there, and also have a look at our website, loads to read there. Listen to Bring Back V10s, which tells classic F1 stories, the Race F1 Tech Show that I referenced with Gary Anderson. That's well worth a listen. And otherwise, we're now going to be making the long journey to Australia to bring you all the coverage from Albert Park. So stay with us on this podcast for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.